Okay, so we're live. We're just waiting now. Just going to wait a moment for the live stream to let us know when we've got a few viewers. That way they don't miss the start of the show.
Beautiful.
Okay. Okay, so we've got someone on now. We've got a few more people. Okay, great. All right, so hi everyone. You're with us again this nice Sunday morning. We are in sunny California. Nice to see more people. I hope everybody is staying safe during the pandemic. I know this is a very difficult point in this crisis, but we have a really great guest. So we're going to get started with the show, and I will introduce myself. So hello everyone, I'm Margot Paez. I'm a scientist, engineer, and occasional journalist, and this is my co-host, Carlos Marroquin. He's the amazingly talented grassroots organizer here, and let me put myself in the center so people can see me. There we go. Hi everyone. So so as I said, that's Carlos Marroquin, and you're watching our weekly Sunday morning show, Stand Up, Fight Back, where we discuss strategy and analysis for the progressive movement. We simulcast on Facebook and YouTube, so please share it with your friends, and please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. Today's guest is Susie Shannon. She's an advocate for homeless and low-income communities and is the City of Los Angeles Health Commissioner. Carlos, would you like to tell us a little bit about Susie today?
Wow, there's so much I can say about Susie, but good morning, everybody across the land, wherever you may be watching us from. Very excited here to be with our guest, Susie Shannon. She's a friend of mine. We have worked together in different things, but there's, as I say, there's so much we can talk about her and the work that she's been doing. But what really I'm impressed about Susie is the courage that she has, the determination to fight for housing, the housing issues that affect so many everywhere now, and including those that are experiencing homelessness. So it is my delight to be able to welcome this morning here on social media our one and only a great advocate in Southern California for housing and homelessness, Susie Shannon. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much. I just want to thank Carlos and Margot so much for having me on today and for that really kind introduction. So yes, I have worked with homeless and low-income communities since 2005 and have seen many iterations for solutions to a lot of the increasing problems that we're seeing. But I think right now, the housing crisis is something that it has become so bad that it's definitely the worst that many of us have seen who work with homeless and low-income communities. So I have been at this intersection where I've been helping particularly our homeless community in all different aspects, helping to move people into housing, working on policy issues, helping to get people connected to services, just doing direct outreach, where you're handing out blankets and food and clothing, just to make sure that, have just what minimal amount we could provide for folks on the street, and learning their people's stories, and then helping to address a lot of the stereotypes that we see in media, on television, and in movies, and which we have found affects policy and how elected officials would address some of the policy. And so I've worked in all those various aspects, and then just trying to make sure that people who are currently elected or candidates are aware of what the situation is within their communities, and just making sure that they understand what we're fighting for in terms of justice and a humane policy toward our homeless and low-income community.
Yes, it's so critical right now because we are facing several major crises, nationally, let alone here in the city of Los Angeles. This is affecting everyone. We have a major blown up pandemic. And of course, we are desperately and keeping an eye uh, on the housing crisis. We're talking about people that have not been able to pay their mortgage, and then we have people that have not been able to pay their rents. But we also have the crisis of homelessness. Daily, the numbers are increasing of people not being able to maintain a roof over their heads. So this is where you play a critical role, Susie, because we need voices in the inside. People don't understand uh, the necessity of us being able to work in the inside. And by that, I mean within the politics and policy, that is critical. And this is your expertise. This is where you have developed connections, relationships. You have done all these things, not only here in Southern California, but at state level. What are some of the things that you are seeing right now? I mean, all of us understand that there is a crisis at all these levels. What are some of the things that you are seeing right now?
Yeah, so if I can set the stage on where we are right now. So before we had the COVID-19 pandemic, we were in a housing and homelessness crisis. There's over 151,000 people who are homeless in the state of California as of the last count. And that was before the COVID-19 pandemic. And then as we slipped into that pandemic and there were stay-at-home orders and people were not allowed to work, there were, tens of thousands of people, actually millions in the state of California, who were out of work and they weren't getting paid and then they couldn't pay the rent. So this is the crisis that we find ourselves in now, and it's extreme. So as I say, we have over 151,000 people who are homeless in the state of California. It's been very hard for our state to even be able to manage that situation, to find housing services, pay for the housing and services, has been an issue. And now, coupled with the COVID-19, according to the Aspen Institute, we have 4 to 5 million people who will be facing eviction next year without, and this is after, because right now the state of California is under an eviction moratorium, and that means that it will expire, right? There was legislation passed, AB 3088, and that will expire at the end of January. So come that time, we have 4 to 5 million people right now who are in danger of being evicted in the state of California. And typically about a third of those will become homeless. So the situation is dire right now. And then to put that in context at a more local level, there's about 365,000 people in the county of Los Angeles who are in danger of becoming evicted early next year without immediate government action. So that means that in the county of Los Angeles alone, we could have the homeless population next year that we see in the entire state of California, just to put that into perspective. So we absolutely need to be advocating right now for immediate assistance from the government. And that means obviously the federal government, but also our state legislature. Because right now, we know that AB 3088 is going to expire at the end of January. And we are right now in the middle of December. So that means we have 6 weeks to move for an extension of that bill, which means that it would have to, go through both houses, and it would have to go through as an emergency bill, which means that we need 2/3 of the legislature, both the Assembly and the State Senate, and we would need the governor to sign that in order to get that extension. So that is an absolute immediate necessity, and everyone needs to be contacting their legislators, contacting the governor's office to push to make that happen. It's unclear to me if there is a will, from the state legislature at the 2/3 right, majority that we need to make this happen. And if 3088 expires, we will have nothing stopping those evictions without maybe the governor's action on this. So we don't know. And so there are a couple of bills that have been put through. So a lot of advocates are supporting AB 15 and 16. This is David Chu's bill. David Chu is an assembly member from up north, and he has put through an extension which would last to the end of next year, right, till the end of December of next year. And this is the AB 1516. And then in the assembly, Senator Caballero has put through another bill, which is SB 3, but that would only extend AB 3088 for 3 months. So we have one bill in the assembly that would extend to the end of next year. We have another bill in the Senate that would only extend for 3 months. So of course, as advocates, we want the bill that will, go to the end of next year. But I will say right now, we are in a protracted period of uncertainty where it's for advocates, I think also for the legal community that help low-income renters. It's very difficult right now to be able to give people advice who are renters and who are facing these evictions on where to go right now, because we don't really know what's going to happen with the state legislature and how quickly things can move through to get approved. So this is like where we are right now. And many people have seen across the state these growing numbers in terms of homelessness. So I'm the drafter of legislation SB 1380, which put the state of California on a housing first model. And what that means is that people who are unhoused would move into housing first and foremost. Currently, our model is that someone would go to a shelter. That's typically for 3 months, and that's only if they are able to stay in that shelter for that long. Sometimes people are asked to leave. Some shelters have rules where people get demerit, and if they break 3 rules, which can be very minor, like how many hangers you can have at your bed, how many times you can leave the facility to go to your car, for instance. These are just like very, minor rules. Then they will get kicked out. And so this model where we have had to have that we've been on, where we've had to have people, quote unquote, housing ready before they move into housing, has been not only very costly, but it's also been very detrimental to our homeless community, because a lot of people, they either don't like the shelters, sometimes there's a lot of issues going on in there, and it's created like a resistance for people going for help, because they have to be in this very protracted period of uncertainty where they don't know when they're actually getting housing. It's kind of like being in a waiting room of an emergency room and the doctor never comes out to see you, because a lot of people are getting ready for housing, but then they never get it. And so they're just waiting forever for this thing that's not necessarily coming. And so there's a movement that I've been part of called Housing First, where it has been shown, and this is a lot of the work has been done by Sam Sambaris, sort of the godfather of the Housing First movement. And he's a psychologist, and he did a lot of studies to show that people actually do much better if you provide the housing first, right? Because the most important service that you can provide to someone who is currently unhoused is housing. And so in the Housing First model, you have the housing first, and then the services are wrapped around that, right? So in other words, if you have a physical disability, obviously it's better to be in housing, so that you can then go to doctor's appointments, you can get physical therapy, all of these other services are needed. If you're on the street you are in a constant state of survival, right? Where are you going to get food? Where are you going to get housing? How are you going to get to a doctor's appointment, but also protect your things that are, sitting there without anyone watching them on the street? And so there's all these questions that come up. And then a lot of times in a lot of cities, law enforcement is a big barrier for folks, because people tend to be, there's a lot of criminalization efforts that are going on, and there's sort of homeless sweeps where they come in and they, force people to move, and they confiscate their belongings. And in that process, sometimes people lose their identification. They lose their birth certificates. Their identification is taken, all of which, as somebody who is an advocate and helps to get people into housing, are needed in order for them to get into that housing. And so the approach to homelessness is broken. It's a very broken system. We do know that Housing First works, and so it's not, it's not a question in terms of what model works. The state of Utah, for instance, reached a functional zero on a Housing First model. They're the first state in the United States to reach a functional zero in their chronic homeless population. Several, Nordic countries have also ended homelessness this way with the Housing First model. So we do know what works. It's just a question of pushing for this model, and also making sure that our elected officials have, bought into this model as well. There's also, I think, a little bit of a disconnect between people who are on the old model, and this would be, a lot of nonprofits, because see, what we've done with our homeless services is we have completely privatized them. So it is private nonprofits that actually are providing these services, and they usually get granted. So they get grants from the government, and those grants don't tend to come with, a duty to accept everybody who comes to your door, and there's not a lot of oversight. So that means that, whereas in a government program, if you go for help, like say unemployment, or to get onto the CalWorks program, which is California's welfare system, if you do that, they can't turn you away. But a private entity, a private nonprofit, can turn you away at the door, right? And so this has created also like huge gaps in terms of services, because, I mean, the upshot is if they don't like you, they don't have to help you. And this has actually happened to some of my clients. I had a client who was referred from the county of Los Angeles to one of the nonprofits. I'm not going to call them out. And he had AIDS. He was living in his car, and with one of his friends, and he, went there for help, and they didn't return phone calls. They didn't really help him. And he was calling me, and I was trying to reach the case manager that was assigned to him within this nonprofit. And they just never called back. And then after a couple of months, of all of this, just, trying to get a hold of them and trying to figure out what was going on, I finally just called the county and said, hey, my client isn't getting any help. What's going on? And they found out that the nonprofit had just dropped him. They just decided they didn't want to help him, and they dropped him because they didn't like him. And he had gone then for, 2 to 3 months, without any services at all, and without any communication that they had dropped him.
Right.
So these are, that brings it down to a very micro level, but this is just why we see a constant increase in homelessness, right? And I'll get to the housing part of this. But, we see this constant rise in homelessness. We don't see any real commitment to creating homeless housing. And this would be housing that is specifically for people who are currently experiencing homelessness. And those two things together are creating an increase in homelessness. And it's also the reason why when this eviction crisis, right, that we are in right now is manifested next year, we are not, it's going to be completely unmanageable, which is why we want to stop it now, right? Because we already know what's happening now isn't working. But if we keep, it's kind of like you're moving toward the cliff, right? You're barreling toward the cliff and you want to stop it. And in order to do that, it's going to create a lot of advocacy, a lot of political will, a lot of folks who are loud and are doing everything that they can for their community of low-income renters and of people who are currently homeless. Because if we see this eviction tsunami come to pass and then a third of those folks become homeless, it's going to make it hard even for people who are currently homeless to keep getting the services that they're on right now. So this is, I mean, I hope I sort of like given you, sort of like from a macro perspective, what's happening. But this is like the biggest crisis that we are facing in California right now. And there are no immediate answers on the horizon. And it's very unclear if we have 2/3 of the legislature that is willing to step up and do the right thing and save our communities and help people from becoming homeless.
Absolutely. And I want to just put a national context to this as well, because we're focusing mainly on Los Angeles and the state of California, but this isn't just a crisis in the state. It's actually also a nationwide crisis. So the statistics that I found before the show is that there's 70% of renters across the country who are behind on payments. And at least 18 million people are at risk, or 18 million renters are at risk of eviction. We have the moratorium, which you touched on. It was also a nationwide moratorium, and that expires December 31st. There's also the expiration of the extended unemployment benefits that covered gig workers who are generally not covered by unemployment, and this is all through the CARES Act. And there's also another program that was covering unemployment for people who ran out of unemployment benefits at the state level, and that's also expiring at the end of the year. And so there's these people who may not be able to make payments starting next year. And those numbers are not even included in this nationwide 18 million of those who are at risk. The other thing that is concerning, and I would love for you to touch on it, is the fact that this moratorium, my understanding is that this is not a cancellation of your rent payments that you're missing, right? This is you have to pay these at some point. So the question there is, how are these people going to pay for their rent once the moratorium is lifted, even if they have a job, right? So then also there's the effect on children, because renters are not necessarily single households. They have children, and what happens when they end up in these unhoused situations? What happens to the children and their education, access to education? So there's a lot of ramifications of just this inability for the state and the federal level to act and provide relief for Americans that is just going to snowball. So Susie, I would love to hear a little more discussion about the fact that this moratorium is not a cancellation of payments, and also if you could touch on what are the effects of being unhoused on children in the California from your experience.
Sure. So first of all, yes, that is true. It's not a cancellation of rent, and that is very important to point out. So AB 3088, which passed last year and was David Chu's bill, which was an eviction moratorium, had a stipulation that the renter would have to pay 25% of their rent in order to stave off eviction. And that rent would come due in January. So that means all of that back rent would come due. And then if we get an extension, obviously we'll extend that. And then there was a payback period for the rest of the rent that's due, right, which is the other 75%, which, of course, for people who are unemployed, people who, are, as you said, like, are not getting unemployment. There's, undocumented workers who are not even in sort of, the federal, plan for assistance, who can't get on Zoom meetings to go to work, that are a factor here. And so one of the things, so there is a huge movement for cancel rent, which many people are part of in our advocacy community. And then there's also another movement that's going on right now, which is for the state to take some of its surplus budget, right? So they have, we don't know exactly what that surplus would be. I've heard up to 28 billion, 26 to 28 billion. And then on the other end, I've heard about 15 billion. But we are asking the state to make sure that at least 5 billion of that money is given as renter assistance so that people can get caught up on their rent. And that could even be the 25% that's owed right now, which would prevent eviction, right? So you see, like, all of these things, they're Band-Aid solutions. Obviously, to cancel rent and to say, look, there were stay-at-home orders. People were told that they couldn't work. People lost their jobs. We understand this is a pandemic. And then with that, you also need mortgage relief, right? And so particularly for the small mom and pops, I'm not so much worried for the corporate the huge corporate landlords who have bought up, like, all these properties across the state of California, who are, multi-billion-dollar organizations. I'm not so concerned about them. But for smaller mom and pops, obviously you do want to have mortgage assistance. If for even just the reason that if they go into foreclosure, it's likely the large corporate landlords that will buy up those properties, right? So we do want to make sure we're providing both renter assistance, and we also want to make sure that we're providing some assistance for small mom and pop landlords. And that could be, there's a lot of things bandied about. That could be, landlords who own 4 units or less, who have fourplexes and that kind of thing. And how that works out in policy, we don't know. But we do need to be advocating right now to make sure that with the surplus dollars, that our low-income communities who, are shafted time and time again with our budgets, right? A lot of our budgets are balanced on the back of people who are at or below the poverty level. A lot of these programs are gutted, and it's time now for people to, now that we have such increasing poverty in the state of California, that everyone is advocating for this particular community. Low-income renters, people who are homeless, people who are out of work, people who are not even in the system, like undocumented workers, people who can't get on Zoom calls for work. All of these communities, and there's a lot of overlap in those communities, so we don't want to silo them. All of these communities are extremely vulnerable right now, and will be, part of this ongoing crisis that we're going to see all into next year, probably to the end of next year.
I tell you that this is the very reason why it's very important for us to have these conversations, because it affects all of us, whether people want to realize it or not. Homelessness affects everyone. Massive evictions, if we have, tsunami evictions, will affect everyone. People not being able to, take the children to school or what have you. Everything affects everybody. So it calls for the movement, for progressives, for the left, if you will, because the right is not going to do anything about this. It's for us to fight for each other, to protect for each other, to fight for what is just and right, And I hope through this show, not only to be able to educate the public and for us to have these kind of conversations, but a level of engagement. Because I seen you, Susie, putting out good fights out there. And there's nothing like being able to put out a good fight, knowing that you have a lot of people behind you. You know what I mean? Because now you could even do more. So I
Yeah.
know that you're a visionary. I know that you see the little men, you see the little woman out there, you see our seniors, our children. You include them in your plans for better policies. You know, how can we involve the people more?
Sure. So there is an ongoing campaign right now. I think it was started on Friday through like a Twitter storm, where we are asking the governor to have a special session of the legislature to deal with this crisis. Everyone will be going back, next year in January, for the legislature, and also to support extending obviously the eviction moratorium, and also to provide at least $5 billion of that surplus, right, of that budget surplus, for our low-income renters. And so if you go to Housing is Human Right, which is part of AIDS Healthcare Foundation, there is there are a lot of things there that you can do. There's like a Facebook page. There's obviously through Twitter you can go on there, and a website as well, and just be part of that campaign, to get the word out, to put pressure on the governor, put pressure on legislators, because ultimately it's going to take a vote, right? It's going to take a vote at the federal level. It's going to take a vote at the state level, and it would be great to have a vote too at the local level, but unfortunately Proposition 21, which would have reformed Costa-Hawkins so that our state legislatures could take a vote on these issues, did not pass. And so anyone who's not currently under rent control, it's very hard to provide renter assistance. So this is why we're pushing so hard at the state level to make sure that our legislators and the governor hear us, because there are lots of competing interests for money, right? Particularly for a surplus in the budget. There are a lot of competing interests from large landlord groups, including corporate landlords, but also the California Apartment Owners Association, who acts in their interest, which is a huge lobbyist within the California legislature and is pushing back. And so we need to make sure that we, as a grassroots force, are louder and stronger and are holding our elected officials accountable, so that they don't go in another direction. And this is extremely important, because getting to 2/3 in the legislature, and I'm somebody who, advocates within, on policy and, within the California state legislature, is very, very difficult. So we need like as much advocacy as we can get. I do want to go back to Margot's question on child poverty. So my family, when I was younger, was homeless, and we ended up living in motels. And so I understand, to some extent, what that all looks like. There are a lot of families who are in motels. I work on Skid Row. There are a lot of more children that I see who are rolling backpacks behind them, walking along the street, while their parents try to find shelter. There are people who have children on the street who are hidden, in boxes or somewhere. And, there's like a huge fear that comes with this for parents, that their children could get taken away. And so it's quite devastating. And from the housing perspective of this, right, we do have to look at that, because a lot of housing that is created for our homeless community, and there's not a lot of that, I should say, but most of what's being created is for individuals. And so it's leaving us with few, the number of families that have a place to go, who are experiencing homelessness is shrinking as we continue to create more and more housing for individuals. And so that, really needs to be addressed. But I think, for parents, I just saw, what my family went through, because my mom became ill. She had cancer, and we fell into poverty very, very quickly. And seeing this, watching this for some of my clients, having children and either ending up on the street or living in motels. And we have so many families living in motels right now as part of the LA Unified School District. It's just devastating, and you mentioned school and, how you have that interaction. And I know in Los Angeles, I know there is a service where tutors will go out to motels and try to help children either get online for online learning or tutor them with books, and try to do that. But there's going to be a huge gap in terms of schooling for children who are in this situation, either living on the street or in motels. I would say even couch surfing, and we have, there are many advocates who have wanted HUD to start changing the definition of homelessness, to include people who are couch surfing as well, who are facing homelessness, obviously. But for right now, everything that we can do to address this issue of child poverty, because what's going to happen is we're losing a generation, right? I mean, I know I'm a mom. I have a 12-year-old, and I have to get her on school, right, every day, online. It's not the same as being in school and, having all the tools and stuff, and, it's a different environment. I think for her, it's kind of working out a bit, but it's still, we're losing a generation here. And for people who are facing eviction and the stress of that, and having to keep that roof over their head and the door that they can shut and lock, it's really, really hard. And to add to that, having to figure out how you're getting your children onto online schooling, how to manage all of this at the same time that a family is in the middle of a crisis, and it's facing eviction, is just, it's monumental. It's just monumental. And so we're going to see a lot of gaps in education, and disproportionately impacted by people who are low income, particularly tenants, and definitely folks in our homeless community, and disproportionately represented by people of color as well.
Susie, this is utterly devastating. There's really no nice way to paint this situation. So many lives are being affected because they don't have a place to live, or they're being kicked out of where they live due to circumstances that are completely out of their control. I'm wondering if you know a little bit about how we got to this place. I mean, this situation has been dire even before the pandemic, and the pandemic is like the climate crisis. It just exacerbates existing issues in our system. Can you touch on that a little bit? How did we get to this point? Because I've heard stories about how, in the 50s, 60s, there were hardly any people living on the streets. So what happened?
So there was not a commitment to low-income housing in this country. There was at some point, and we had a lot of public housing. And I think I explained before how we have privatized our homeless services, but we've also privatized and commoditized housing. So there was a time when we had a lot of public housing. This is housing that is owned and managed by the federal government. And there were a lot of housing development. And this actually helped a lot of folks who were low income. And I would say a lot of folks who were discriminated against, a lot of folks who were stuck in very low paying jobs, people who are suffering from disabilities. And so there was, housing that was created just to make sure that people, you know, could have a roof over their head. And I would say it's not just a roof over your head, because a shelter will give you that roof. It's also a door that you can lock and some privacy, which a lot of us take for granted, because people who are unhoused will tell you that the lack of privacy is very stressful. And so sometimes they won't go into a shelter environment because their tent feels more private to them than going into a shelter situation. So we had this huge, you know, we had a very comprehensive system of providing public housing for folks who needed it. And then in the 1990s, we moved away from that. And so a lot of the public housing that was kind of deteriorating, right? So it wasn't necessarily kept up. It would sometimes depend on like what party to like the president, you know, was part of, or, you know, the makeup of Congress, and whether or not money from the budget was taken away for maintenance. And so some of the housing was deteriorating a little bit. But instead of just fixing it up, they did sort of like an extreme makeover. And what they did was create what's called mixed income communities. And they, in some cases, they've leveled public housing altogether, such as in Chicago with Cabrini Green. And in other places, they did a disposition of these units, but they didn't bring all the tenants back. And so we've had a net loss in the hundreds of thousands of public housing. And this is where it kind of started. And then at the same time, they created a privatized model, which we know of as Section 8, right? And this is where someone, right, a tenant will get a voucher, and you have to, it's like winning the lottery to get one of these vouchers. It's actually very, very difficult. The waiting lists are years long. Homeless set-aside vouchers for people who are homeless are much quicker, right? Because they do set aside some of these vouchers for people who are unhoused. But that requires someone to kind of run around their city looking for a landlord who will take them. A lot of my clients could never find that landlord. They either couldn't find a unit that was available, they couldn't find a landlord who would take them. They were still subjected to credit checks, still having to come up with deposits or last month's rent. You can see all of these are humongous barriers to actually getting into housing. And so at the same time we're getting rid of public housing, we've privatized now the monies that were given to tenants, right, or that were used for tenants to be in housing. And then it created this extra barrier for folks. And so at the same time, we had developers, very wealthy developers, and now we have large corporate developers who were creating more and more luxury housing. They were not creating housing for people who are low income. And so we had this net loss over time for people who are low income, extremely low income, very low income, and extremely low income. And so what I started doing, the way that I got involved with the Democratic Party was that I was advocating for housing for people who are at 30% of the area median income and below. So that would mean people who are on Social Security, people who are on SSI, which is our state disability program, people who are getting general relief, which you should know, like just in LA County alone, that is $221 a month. That's what people are expected to live on, $221 a month, plus what's food stamps, but what we call CalFresh, which is usually like, for my clients, about $100 a month if they're an individual. So this is what people have to actually live on. And so I was advocating for that housing and for no cuts to these programs when I entered into the Democratic Party to try to get elected officials. I was basically trying to use the party as a tool to get elected officials to pay attention to this and trying to make sure that their endorsement or the questions that they were being asked as part of the endorsement process was about these programs and making sure that they were on board for providing housing for people at 30% of the area median income and below. So you can see sort of how this is happening, right? And then as the homeless population is increasing over time, right? So when I drafted SB 1380, which was the Housing First legislation, there were about 116,000 people who were homeless in the state of California. That was in 2016. By 2020 now, we have over 151,000. Now we have more than that, but we have to do the homeless count so that we have actual data and figures. But you can see over time how this is increasing because we are on what is a failed model. We are not putting the money and investment into housing that we need. We are allowing developers to create the plans. So cities should be creating a comprehensive plan based on the needs of the community, based on the needs of their cities, based on the needs of the county. And then they should put that out for bid and say, this is what we need. If you are a developer that can provide this, that's great. But adopting a developer's plan, which is based on how much profit that they can get out of a development project, which of course includes luxury housing, a lot of luxury housing, where we have a vacancy, right? And it includes very little low-income housing, sometimes none, and sometimes no extremely low-income housing. And these are developers who want all of this give, right, from the government. They want variances. They want money. They want all of these things to help their project. But unfortunately, it's not really what's needed for the community, and it's not really helping our homeless community. My feeling is, the homeless issue, it's like a triage situation. So, in other words, going back to the sort of this analogy of the emergency room, the waiting room, if you have two people in an emergency room that are having a heart attack, and you have two people in an emergency room who have broken arms, if the doctor came out and said, we're going to take one, and this isn't even the model here, but we're going to take one person who's having a heart attack, but we're also going to take, the person who has the broken arm, because we want to make sure we're helping everyone, right? And this is like, the statement that we need housing at all income levels, right? If a doctor said that, you would think that doctor had completely lost their mind, right? Because in a triage situation, you take the people who need it the most first. And that means the two heart attack patients who could die, right? And literally on our streets, people who are unhoused are dying every single day. You take the people who need it the most first. But our housing model has not been that way. Our housing model has been exactly the opposite of that, where we are creating more luxury housing, more housing at moderate income levels. We are literally creating housing for people who are already housed in the homeless capital of the United States. Think of how crazy that sounds, right? So this is sort of how we got into this situation, and it needs to be rectified quickly. When I was working, so I did a lot of work on the Utah model. I mean, not work, but a lot of research. I brought out the people who had started the Housing First program in Utah, which is our most successful program in the United States. I brought them out in 2015 to LA, and we did a big conference, and they talked about how they did it. And Holly Mitchell was there, State Senator Holly Mitchell, a number of other legislators were there, and I know Ben Allen was there, and then a lot of our local elected officials. And we, decided we were going to move forward with this Housing First legislation. But one of the ways, so as this legislation was moving through the Senate and the Assembly, I kept hearing, I was able to get a lot of support, and it was mainly because of my ties to the Democratic Party, because a lot of legislators knew me, they knew what I was trying to do, and some of them had been at this conference. But all along the way, everyone was telling me the governor is not going to sign this bill, right? So it's moving through the Senate. It got all the support that it needed in the Senate and the Assembly. And then we had this governor who had been inimical to legislation helping our homeless community, who had basically vetoed giving protected status to our homeless community, even though, people were in our homeless community were getting set on fire or beaten with bats or, had rocks thrown at them and were being targeted. We couldn't get the governor to sign protected status or an interagency council. So my strategy with the governor's office, and Jerry Brown was the governor at the time, was basically to sell this as a fiscal model, because we save $35,000 to $45,000 per person that's chronically homeless on the street by providing permanent supportive housing. So by not addressing our homeless crisis, by not saying to our developers, this is our city plan, and we are looking for developers who want to work with us to create housing for our unhoused community. By not doing that, it has cost taxpayers an enormous amount of money. And as we increase homelessness, and that's why, and why is it important for you to say that? Because not everyone is moved by the humanitarian argument. There are people who are inimical to our homeless community. They have, they are operating under these stereotypes that they've seen on TV, that they hear about, and that have no basis in truth. And so, our unhoused community, discrimination against our unhoused community is one of the last acceptable forms of discrimination. There are things, even from people in the progressive community, I have heard people say things about our unhoused community that are stereotypical and so discriminatory. And it's because there isn't the education. It's because of reinforcements from the media. It's because of reinforcements from elected officials, from community members, neighborhood councils, and that is there for a reason, and that actually helps, right? The corporate developers, that helps, a lot of folks who benefit from that, right? By creating this false narrative and making it sort of okay to discriminate. And so you need to make the financial argument, because when they say, well, people don't want to go for help, or people don't, every time that happens, you need to say, look, our current system of not creating homeless housing, our current system of allowing our low-income tenants to be evicted and to become homeless, and it's not, it's people who, we're middle income now, who now are low income, right, because of the pandemic as well. By doing that, it is costing everyone this, $35,000 to $45,000 per person that ends up on the street, and it stays there for years, and this is over time. So it's, the approach has not been what's needed. Moneyed interests are too much in play and too powerful at our local government level, at our state level, even at our federal level. And so all of that needs to be reversed. And, it's so funny, because elected officials would ask me, because I'm on the ground, right? I'm on the ground on Skid Row, in other areas. I help people who are homeless move into housing. I work on policy issues. But year after year, elected officials would say, well, what do you think? I mean, we've created this affordable housing. Do you think we're going to see an increase in homelessness? And I would say, yes, we are seeing an increase in homelessness, because a lot of elected officials didn't even know that the affordable housing that they were creating was not for our homeless community. It was for people who are moderate income. And in fact, it's even worse than that, because in LA, and this is, something that I discovered just because I was helping a client, there were 27 units of affordable housing that were created in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles with $6 million of money from the city. And in order to apply for it, you had to have 36 months of permanent rental history. And that meant with no gaps. So what does that mean? That means that you can't be homeless now, but you can't have been homeless for the last 3 years in order to qualify for one of their affordable apartments. So this is all the game playing. And it's not like the council ever knew, because there wasn't any oversight. And you wouldn't even think that this would be a problem until somebody brings it to you and says, hey, what is this application? And why are we basically saying that our unhoused community can't have access to affordable housing that's being created in a city that is literally the homeless capital of the United States?
Wow.
Carlos, would you like to say something or ask a question? I have a lot of thoughts too, but I want to give you an opportunity.
So much that you have covered here today, Susie, and which is at the tip of the iceberg. Really, that's the reality that we're living in, because we not only see a broken system, but we also see how much it needs to be done, and there's a lot of work to be done. So meanwhile, we have a political crisis all over the nation. We have, pretty much, we're walking in a territory that we don't know about how much is actually going to be needed, which is know that it's going to be a lot. I like the thinking of, the government being able to create, a lot of housing that, moving those with priority first, those that are the highest risk. And also we cannot forget the working class, because the fact of the matter is that cost of living is skyrocketed. And those that were able to afford something before cannot afford it no more. And, trying to go back to work for some people, it's just, it's a complete mess out there. Everywhere that I go throughout the city, I see developments going up. It has not stopped. The pandemic didn't stop the developers for continuing to push and create, housing, but it's the wrong kind of housing. Where do we go from here, Shannon?
Well, I think there's a few things. So, one of the things that we saw in the city of Los Angeles was, we passed a measure which was HHH. And this was to provide, a lot of money for our homeless community. And what happened was they started to create units that literally cost $500,000 to $700,000 a unit from the developers. Now, you could actually buy a condominium for people who are homeless, so they could have been homeowners for about $400,000 to $450,000, and instead we're creating these small units for $500,000 to $700,000 per unit. So, and some of them were a little less expensive than that, but some of them were that high. And if you look at that in the context of maybe what was done in the UK, where they were creating these prefab modular units, right, modular housing, for about £50,000 a piece. And they have a much higher cost of living in the UK. You can see that there's just a taking, there's not enough oversight, and no one is in charge. Someone needs to be in charge, and someone needs to say, here is what we need. We need this price point per unit, and we need to make sure we have this many units come online. So we could have had twice the number of units had we used different building models, like prefab modular housing. There's like containers. There's also adaptive reuse, which we saw. One of the things with the pandemic that we saw was this move into converting motels into housing. And sometimes, that means adding a kitchenette in there. Sometimes it means, but we saw that we rapidly had to move to a place where people could get into housing as quickly as possible, rather than congregate shelter, where, you could be transmitting the virus among our unhoused community. But this is, another area where we need to be creating more housing. We need to look at vacant units. We have almost enough vacant units to house every single person that is homeless in Los Angeles, but we just don't have access to them. So a master leasing program where an organization or company leases out these units, and they become the tenant, and then they are able to put people in without them having to go through credit checks, having to go through, how the landlord approving them. And these are usually insured, so the company or the organization will have insurance, and they will guarantee to the landlord that the unit will be returned with normal wear and tear. That's been a very successful program, I think, in Los Angeles, but there's only like one county program that's even working on that. But we need to expand that. So as a health commissioner, I used to be the president of the health commissioner. We did ask for that program to be expanded, and for the city to put money into this county program to expand that, because we do have housing already. We have vacant units. We have places that can be, through adaptive reuse turned into housing. That's both residential property and commercial property. These are all answers, but it just requires political will. Rather than everyone seeing this as just a model where we're building from the ground up new housing, which is also needed, we also need to be very creative on how we're looking at housing, how we're seeing housing, and how we can move people quickly, to have that roof over their head and the door to shut, for privacy. So that there are many of us who are, working to make sure that these models, which can come online quickly, and we don't have to wait, for a 10-year plan to end homelessness. There are many of us working on, trying to get our elected officials to move in that direction so that we can get people housed as quickly as possible. Because like I said, if that tsunami of evictions is realized next year or even into the following year, we don't have a strategy right now in the state government and local government for addressing the number of people that we are going to see who are unhoused on the street. There's already so much tension in neighborhoods right now. There's a lot of pressure being put on elected officials to go back to a criminalization model. And we've sort of seen it a little bit here in Los Angeles, where they're trying to clear out the freeway underpasses because of Judge Carter's order. And, law enforcement will show up and people's belongings are confiscated in the process of trying to move them. And also the insanity of trying to move people in the middle of a pandemic, when you're, moving folks from different homeless encampments, moving them together could create exposure to that virus. And it's against even CDC recommendations. You can see that, the answer here really needs to be housing, and we need to make sure we have the housing in order to, address this situation. And all the old models of, the shelter system, criminalization, these sweeps, homeless sweeps, where they use the fact that they have to clean the sidewalk as an excuse to confiscate people's property and to move them away from where they are, and then sometimes keep them indefinitely away, needs to stop. We need a much more humanitarian approach with complete buy-in from somebody who is living on the street, in order to do that. I mean, it's not to say that you don't want to clean the sidewalks and power wash them, and many members of our unhoused community want that too. It's the way that they are doing it. It's how they are harassing people. It's asking them to move away from shelters. There's like in LA, there's an ordinance that we were able to kill. But there was an ordinance that basically says people couldn't be within 500 feet of bridge shelters. And some of that is enforced now because of an early ordinance that passed. So, none of these things are solutions. They're not even Band-Aid solutions. They're a way of appeasing people in the community who just simply don't like to see people living on the streets in their neighborhood, and they are putting pressure on our elected officials to turn homelessness into, criminal activity, which is just absolutely ridiculous. There is no place for people to go. There literally is nowhere for them to go. And our, elected officials have been somewhat complicit in this, or have not, maybe been ignorant, or, just have not shown the political will to address this from a humanitarian perspective. And we are now paying the price for that in the middle of a pandemic, where now more people are going to be homeless. And it's like the solution, it's almost like, the Titanic has hit the iceberg and we're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, but there aren't enough lifeboats, and the people who are going to go down, I'm Irish, so a lot of those folks who died in steerage were Irish like me. And the ship's going down, and there aren't enough lifeboats, and more people are falling into this without a solution.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, Susie. And also, again, on the national level, all that you've described is not unique to California. I mean, I did some affordable housing organizing in New York in before 2010, and we had the same issues. There were 70% of the condos were vacant, and one of the ideas that our various organizations came together and proposed was the city should take over these condos and house people, because the housing is there. Just as you said here, the housing is already there. These units are empty. They were designed as luxury apartments, luxury condos, and nobody is living in them. And a lot of these developers, they evade paying taxes at the state level. So the state isn't even benefiting from this. But the problem is, and perhaps this is the same thing in California, but in New York, this is a huge problem, is that the boards that make the decisions on housing are packed with people who have corporate interests, real estate interests behind them. And so they're making decisions that benefit these real estate developers, these real estate corporations, and they don't care at all about people. And so I think, because everything that you've been saying about this having political will, that what we really need is for more people who are like-minded, like you, Susie, and our viewers, all of the Bernie supporters out there, all of the AOC supporters, the Rashida Tlaib supporters, if you think you're a progressive and you agree with everything that Susie has discussed today, then you need to do something about this. And we need to vote out people who are not making decisions on the behalf of the majority of Americans, like the 99% of Americans. And not only that, because voting isn't enough, we need to elect the right people. And so I think our viewers really need to step up and run for these offices. And the reason why I say that is because if they don't do it, if you don't do it, our viewers, if you don't do it, then the people who are willing to take money from anybody and just have a nice shiny title are the ones who are going to take these spots, and we're never going to solve these problems, because, as Susie has said, the solutions are already here. We don't need these long-term plans. We don't need to necessarily, of course we do need, it's always good to build more housing, but we already have ways in which we can house people. It's like with the climate crisis, we already have ways that we can solve this issue. It's like with healthcare, we already know what the solutions are. We need people in positions of power to make these happen. So yes, running for office is not easy. It takes work, but we can find community support, and we have proved to ourselves that we can do this. We did have Bernie signs and make it as far as he did, all through small dollar donations. So this is possible, and I really want to encourage our viewers to take a stand. Don't be afraid. You don't need to be the smartest person in the room. You don't need to be the most educated person in the room. You don't need to have all of the answers. You just have to have a good heart and be ethical, because there are so many people who are in these positions of office who are unethical and don't care. I think that really is the main requirement. You can learn everything else as you go, and there are experts like Susie who you can turn to for guidance once you get into these positions of power. But the important thing is to have that moral compass that so many of our political officials lack, and also that absolute hatred for corporate money, right? Because that is also a big problem with our political leadership. So Susie, I really want to thank you so much for being on the show with us today. We are out of time. Carlos, do you have anything else that you would like to add before we wrap up?
Yes, I just would like to ask Susie, I know that you're working in so many different projects right now. What kind of support do you need from the public?
We need a lot of pressure on the governor. So many of you may have heard that the governor's chief of staff is leaving, and the new chief of staff is going to be Jim DeBoo, who is a consultant for the real estate industry, for corporate developers, who was a consultant on the No on 21 campaign, so basically anti-renter, and he is now going to be the chief of staff for the governor of California. So to the extent that the grassroots can be pushing on the governor and on their legislators, it would be extremely helpful. But everyone should be contacting the governor and have a very loud voice, because, you know, on the inside, if staff is saying one thing, you know, we need to have a voice on the outside that's saying no.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as always on Sundays, you know, you're taking the time to be with us. I really admire your work, Susie, and the commitment that you have to the public, to the people, to our families. This is not only short term, but long term, because you've been there for many years doing the good fights. And sometimes, you know, working inside, people get criticized. But I can tell you, you know, I'm watching you and I admire your work. I'm one of your fans. I am a supporter. And anything that we can do, please, you know, I hope that we can have you on the show again, because there's so much to talk about.
I know there really is a lot to talk about. I'd be happy to come on again, and also to recommend others if you want to, you know, expand out the conversation. But thank you so much for doing this. I mean, it's just any way we can get the word out is really important. Carlos, I mean, I've known you for so long, and I know that, you know, you have you've done so much great work, and you have so many people around you, like throughout the state. That this is just a fantastic opportunity. And I want to thank Margot too, and for adding all the information about New York, because yeah, this is definitely a national problem. But we are, you know, Los Angeles is the homeless capital of the United States, and it's just so outrageous. You know, in a state that has over 151,000 people who are homeless, in a county that has over 68,000 people who are homeless in LA, to still be dealing with these issues where we're trying to push back on corporate interests, corporate developers, and actually get help for people who are low income.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Well, everyone, we're at the end of the show. So again, thank you for joining us. You've been watching Stand Up, Fight Back. And I'm one half of the host. I'm Margot Pais, and Carlos Marroquin, he is the other half of the hosts on this show. And we air every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. And if you liked what you saw today, please hit the like button, please subscribe, and most importantly, please share us with your friends and family. We will be back next week. We try to bring as many interesting guests on as possible, and we really want to engage on the level of grassroots organizing, strategy, and analysis around the progressive movement. So thank you. Have a really wonderful Sunday, and please stay safe and please stay healthy.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.